You're telling them you can't be part of NATO. You're telling them you don't get your territory back. Or Russia. NATO encroaching on them.
They are an independent country.
If you are satisfying someone that we all agree is a dictator and authoritarian to that level, don't you think maybe the methods aren't that great?
We've got more to look at with liberal Jessica Tarlov setting the record straight with her MAGA propagandist co-host, this time about Russia and Zelensky and the Republican response. So be sure to like and subscribe. Helps us out a ton, and let's hop right in.
Putin doesn't want this war. Zelensky doesn't want this war. Trump doesn't want this. So they're all in agreement.
But they're not in agreement because this actually has to come down to the brass tacks of how that country gets split up.
And who holds the cards?
No. I get it.
Zelensky.
Big man, I get it. I heard it. Tommy Tuberville was on TV today saying this is about what Putin and Donald Trump want. This doesn't have to do with Zelensky. But guess what? There are millions of Ukrainians who would beg to differ. No, they're not dead.
They don't have a future with him. They do not have a future with Zelensky. Zelensky is dependent upon us.
Do you guys get what you're saying? You're just saying that a sovereign country. Yes, I do. But
this is oversimplification at its finest, which is a MAGA specialty. Yes, all three of them want an end to the war, but for different motives with different outcomes. Putin probably wants all of the land he's taken thus far, and for Ukraine to remain in a state where he can, of course, hope to claim more of it later. Zelensky wants as much as Ukraine back as possible and security guarantees to protect Ukrainian sovereignty going forward. Trump wants whatever is going to stroke his ego the most, or whatever's best for whoever strokes his ego the most, which is definitely Putin and whatever other, backroom going ons they have together, seemingly, which is why it's not as simple as Zelensky just giving in to the two, clearly trying to give him the shit end of the stick in one way or the other when he needs to look out for what's best for his people. But Europe also outspends us on Ukraine aid, so let's stop this narrative of like America carrying the water for them.
You're telling them you can't be part of NATO. You're telling them you don't get your territory back.
No, because that was agreed upon decades ago. And every decade they move closer and closer to Russia, NATO has. And the Crimea and everything else is a response to NATO.
Or Russia. NATO encroaching on them.
They are an independent country who believes, and I'm not pro-Russia at all.
Really?
But
it doesn't sound like that.
Don't give me that, really.
Don't give me that.
Don't give me that.
No, it was literally never agreed that NATO wanted to expand east. This is another Kremlin talking point that she couldn't give you any historical context for. This comes from an informal statement made by our Secretary of State when not even negotiating anything NATO related, but instead German reunification with the Soviet Union. James Baker, the Secretary of State, again, didn't propose this as any official agreement. It wasn't put forth as any part of the negotiation, and he wouldn't have had the power to do so anyway. It's something he informally said in passing, nor was NATO expansion something Russia even opposed at the time, as the Soviet Union was still standing. It was once it dissolved a year later that they then wanted to worry about NATO expansion, because clearly now such expansion would hinder their rebuilding of the Soviet Union. The entire premise that we ever agreed to not expand east is predicated entirely on Russian propaganda. If you couldn't tell by, the spirited defense of Russia to show you how deep the Russian infiltration is on the right, that definitely should.
These are all things that Putin wants to hear. And you know that because his own spokesman, Peskov, said as much, said the rapidly changing U.S. foreign policy configurations largely coincides with our vision. Dmitry Medvedev, the insolent pig about Zelensky, finally got a proper slapdown in the Oval Office. Trump is right. The Kyiv regime is gambling with World War III. So if you are satisfying someone that we all agree is a dictator and authoritarian to that level, don't you think maybe the methods aren't that great? And that's not to say that we don't need to come to the table and say, this is what our peace plan is. These are the territorial lines that we are comfortable with. No one thinks that he's going back to a pre-2014 era. Zelensky himself doesn't think that.
Right? I mean, it's something that either way should be entirely disqualifying. Trump is either very clearly doing the bidding of an authoritarian dictator as the president of the United States, of the leader of the free world, which is as impeachable of an offense as I've ever heard, or his actions just happen to line up entirely with Russian interest, which should call into question his fitness to be president of the United States, and entirely vindicates the left for the Russia, how the right pretended this was something to make fun of us for, but how dare us woke lefties prefer a president that fights fascism and opposes dictators rather than coddling their balls in spite of our democratic allies.